I am too. It's very organizing, calming.
All right, everybody, it's 3:05. We'll come back on. And today we have an additional leadership session this afternoon, since just this morning we started with our ITT evaluations. And I heard, Kate, that we were nervous for him, but he ended up being a lovely, sweet baby angel. So yay for them coming from a great distance, and B, yay that he was awesome to work with. So we have been kind of modifying the diversity, equity, and inclusion series throughout this year because we wanted to infuse more timely information. And so as you had heard the very first session, Allie Fisher had helped us over the summer revamp like most of our curriculum to make sure that we're interweaving current literature in DEI into topics where they are available, where there is research for them. And so after the last session we had with Jamila Hackworth, I remember, I think it was Courtney put in the chat box, even something along the lines of like, when would we get to practice these scenarios? So today we've built this, Allie, I should say, has built this where we've talked through some information, and then we're going to go through some scenarios, do some small group breakouts, and then we're also going to have an additional session later where you probably can't even remember, but you took a DEI survey at the very beginning of Lend, and it had, ways, different things that you would define and scenarios and how you would feel in terms of addressing those scenarios and kind of talking about clinically and policy related research. And we're going to have another session where we kind of review some of those scenarios too. So this is part one, and then we're going to get into some more of it a little later in the semester in one of our open sessions. Allie, anything else to update before you get going? I think that's all, right?
I think so.
Okay. Awesome. Well, I'll go off mute or go on mute and stay quiet.
Are there any non-Lend people in the house today?
I think we have one. Bryson, you are a genetic counselor?
Bryson and me.
Yep. Yes. Okay. So one genetic counselor who's not in the Lend cohort.
Okay. Well, then I'll just reintroduce myself. So my name is Allie Fisher. I'm a fourth year graduate student in clinical psychology at the University of Cincinnati. I did Lend last year and had a blast. And since then, I have developed a passion for improving the process of sharing diagnoses and the evaluation process, specifically for autism, but I'm also interested in developmental disabilities in general. So we'll be talking about equity and policy through the lens of the diagnostic or diagnosis process today. So, of course, as a starting off caveat, I am a white cisgendered woman with a great deal of education without any visible disabilities. And so I'm coming at this from definitely an outsider perspective. And the majority of the focus on today's lecture is going to be race and ethnicity, because that's what I have done a systematic review in. And so with that being said, I'm white, I have not experienced systematic racism or oppression. And so again, I'm coming at this from an outside perspective. I'm happy to be corrected or guided or helped if I make mistakes along the way. We all make lots of mistakes and we are all continuing to learn and grow. So I'm always happy to receive feedback there. So the goals of today are to understand disparities in the diagnosis of autism and other developmental disabilities, and to think critically about provider and system level changes that need to be made to bring about equitable care for families undergoing a diagnosis or going through a diagnosis process. So the goal would be that after this workshop, everyone is able to describe many factors that are affecting the diagnostic process for marginalized groups, critically think about individual provider and system level factors affecting families and children's care, and identify many provider and system levels changes that need to be made to improve equity in the diagnostic process. So I'm going to do a somewhat brief overview of the literature. I'm going to start it off by talking about the literature in general about the diagnosis of autism and other developmental disabilities to kind of get us into that frame of mind. And then I'm going to focus specifically on the intersection between race and ethnicity and the diagnosis of autism, because that's what I know the most about. Then we're going to break off into small groups and do some case scenarios where we apply what we learn to understand these case scenarios. Then you guys will have to remind me so we can take a break. And then we will do some policy discussions. So that's where we'll be applying our knowledge to sort of what the problems are in the diagnostic process and thinking about provider and system level changes, including policies that could be or should be made to improve equity. So I keep saying equity, and I feel like most people probably know what equity is, but I think we should all make sure we all understand what equity is before we delve into this lecture, because we'll be talking a lot about inequity or things that aren't equitable. So could someone give me a definition of equity?
I don't know if this is going to be a dictionary definition, but making sure people have the right resources that match their needs and situation.
Exactly. So equality would be people having the same thing. So everyone gets the same thing. And equity is people getting what they need, because everyone's needs are going to be different. And can you guys put in the chat whether you think that everyone starts off on the same playing field when their child enters into the healthcare system? And so just share a quick yes or no. And if no, maybe share one or two things that might be different for some groups, why people are not on the same playing field when they enter their child into the healthcare system. So if you guys can think of it, one or so examples. Genetics, social biases, definitely. Trust in medical, oh, we're going to talk about that. Trust in medical field based on past experiences. Language barriers, not having access to information, access to healthcare, ability to get into appointments, understanding of the healthcare system, more about access. So access is huge. Having long-term supports, financial stabilities, biases of behaviors. So biases towards different groups of people can affect families' care, both when they're getting care for themselves and for their children. These are all really good examples. And sort of to tie into equity and inequity, I wanted to talk about marginalization, because I will be using that as sort of a broad term today to represent why families have different healthcare experiences and receive different care. So can someone give me a different definition of what marginalized or marginalization means?
I'm also not gonna have a direct definition, but how like a person or a group of people are treated, and like most of the time it's like unjust and there isn't like that fair equity part of it.
Yeah, and also when you guys give answers, can you give me, I mean, I see your, well, give me your name and then can you give me your discipline?
I'm Shannon, I'm from social work.
Awesome. Yeah, so treated or provided with different opportunities. And so when we think of marginalization, I think of like to the margins. And so this is sort of both experiences of how people are treated in their lives, but also if we think about it on a more global or systemic level, people are marginalized by policies that create differences in ability to get a job, sustain a job. People are, policies are intact that give people different access to transportation, to healthcare, all of these different things. And then there's also marginalization because of our history as a society that values men and whiteness. And all of those things can contribute to marginalization. Now I kind of wish I had a textbook definition in front of me. But let's explore the concept of marginalization by talking about what kinds of identities can lead to being marginalized. Not that it's the person's identity's fault, but because of our society, what groups of people are marginalized? Yes, thank you, Jason. You added, our society also values able-minded and can you pronounce that term, Jason?
Oh, I spelled it wrong. Able-bodiedness.
Okay, able-bodiedness. Okay. Yes, definitely. So having lower socioeconomic status can contribute to marginal. I hate when I say contribute to marginalization because it makes it seem like it's the fault of the person of lower socioeconomic status. But people of lower socioeconomic status are marginalized in our society. It's really how I meant to say it.
System set up, I guess. Sorry.
Yes, it's the systems that are set up that create marginalization for people of lower socioeconomic status. And then Steph added, the dictionary definition of marginalization is treatment of a person, group, or concept as insignificant or peripheral. And yeah, so when we think of that, I think of that as society is treating a person, group, or concept as insignificant and peripheral. And because society treats different groups of people as insignificant or peripheral, that contributes to more individually mediated marginalization, which means that individuals treat other individuals as insignificant or peripheral. So what are some other groups who experience marginalization?
I was just going to make a quick comment, just because you had said the way that you worded it. The CDC put out like a style guide. I think it was actually in 2020 in response to COVID. And they started to address some of these like just wordings.
Mm-hmm.
And it was like this movement from saying marginalized groups, which places like a victimization or fault on the group, as opposed to groups that have been marginalized, saying that they are a result of a system set up against them, as opposed to it being their own fault or their identity's fault that they are marginalized. And so I think that just plays right on with what you were sharing. Even just like that wording can be triggering or can put people in a situation where they're experiencing stigma immediately, even when we're trying to do our best to address the systems that have created a marginalized society. Yeah. So I just wanted to share that really quick.
Yeah, definitely.
I'm in public health.
There we go. Okay, awesome. Yes, thank you so much for saying that. So what you're talking about is referring, as long as I'm understanding you correctly, is referring to system-centered language. So centering our terms around the systems that created marginalization and oppression rather than blaming the people. And, oh, I love that you attached it too. Do you feel like, is that an accurate description of what you were saying?
Yeah. And I think understanding the effect that our language can have on the people that we're talking about.
Yes. Oh, and they have one for people with disabilities. If you want to post that, Jason, that would be awesome. Yeah, and so I've seen things before, like calling a group at risk is blaming the system, or is blaming the individual who is at risk rather than the system that creates risks for certain groups of people. There's also, well, I'm sharing slides right now, so it'd be hard for me to, but I'm glad you guys are all posting these things. And then groups who have been historically and currently marginalized have been based on, as Jason added, race, religion, gender, ability status, socioeconomic status, colorism, education level, housing status, age, sexual orientation, geographical, weight. So yes, you've created a really great list there, Jason, of, I'm going to make sure all my language is right, of people who have been marginalized by society. And there are definitely more. I would agree 100%. So you'll also, kind of based on what our discussion about language, you'll hear me use the term racial and ethnic minoritized individuals or caregivers. Has anyone heard or used that term minoritized rather than minority before? Jason, I'm seeing a thumbs up. I can only see a certain group, a small group of people. Megan said yes. I have been using that term as sort of a systems approach to these groups of people aren't minorities, rather they've been minoritized by our society. I always worry that system-centered terms are coming from, can increase sort of like deficit thinking, like, oh, these poor groups of people who have been pushed to the side by society, and kind of like ignoring the positive aspects of people who have been minoritized and marginalized. And I'm curious what other people think about that, or if the benefits of using this sort of language outweigh any potential negative sides of it. So I'm wondering what other people think about it. Yeah, Jason?
I mean, I guess this is Jason. I'm from advocacy and I have a little bit of a background in disability studies, even though Pat is the disability studies official person. And I think, one, it depends on context and if that's only the way that you're talking about a group or if you're only looking at it. But I think there is power, especially for people who, especially at early beginnings of movements, when people have been looked at as individualized and that it's something individually wrong with them rather than the way that systems are put, that it puts it as a societal responsibility rather than just that group's responsibility.
Yeah.
But I would agree, yeah, you wouldn't want it to make it that's the only indication of that group, or you only think of that group as being reactive to oppression. There would be other also cultural identities and significance, whether it's around autistic people and stuff, or race or religion or stuff, that it's not the only response factor that that culture has.
Yeah, I like that you talked about how when we use this sort of language, it puts the onus back on society, or the responsibility back on society. to correct its wrongdoings. And then I appreciate that you mentioned the importance of not just thinking of people as their oppression or people as the marginalization that they've experienced. So I definitely appreciate both of those things that you said. All right, if anyone else has any thoughts about it, feel free to put them in the chat or shout them out at any time. So I will start going into a literature review of factors that affect families' experiences with the diagnostic process of autism and other developmental disabilities. And this is specifically targeted towards thinking about groups who have been marginalized by our society. So one of the factors influencing the diagnostic process is differences in culture. And I'm not going to go into differences in cultural beliefs regarding developmental disabilities because we do not have time for that. But I will say that multiple national studies have found that caregivers of color of children with a developmental disability were more likely to report that their providers were not culturally sensitive and did not make them feel like a partner in their care. And so this was focused mostly on their opinions about pediatricians. Also, caregivers whose children were ultimately diagnosed with autism with a higher household income were more likely to report being satisfied with their care. So what are some reasons why providers aren't culturally responsive to families who have different backgrounds than the backgrounds of providers? So providers have a history of whiteness and maleness.
Well, not that, I mean, even just the way that it's taught and stuff,
Okay.
and sort of thought about, and even with Autism Speaks in their marketing campaigns, I mean, and the reason they chose the color blue and who was sort of looked at in some of the, and even that it's considered extreme male behavior at some point, and sort of there's just even the marketing promotional materials of mostly white people and mostly white males.
Yeah, so when we think about the history, there is a history of education, and education focuses mostly on white males, and that's for like medical education in general, and then for autism specifically or other developmental disabilities specifically. And then you talked about marketing. So how we see these developmental disabilities being portrayed all over within advocacy organizations. I mean, I don't know, within medical textbooks, within the media, we are not seeing a multitude of cultures represented. And then I think you might have briefly touched on research. So our research about autism and other developmental disabilities stems largely from white middle-class males. And so that's how we learn a lot of things. And then that's what we're teaching in education. And then that's what providers know. And then James said, another contributing factor is that the conceptualization of disorders like ASD are almost entirely based on Western and white concepts of disordered behavior. I'm really glad that you threw in the Western aspect of this, because I think that that's an important part, is that we are looking at what is a disorder based on our cultural norms of what is normal and what is not normal. And then you talked about shifting from disability rights, which is mostly white-based, to disability justice. And Jason, can you give us a quick definition of disability justice?
Oh, I know they have the 10 tenets, but it's more looking at the systems and having an intersectional approach and understanding the sort of congruence of race and gender and sexuality, and looking at disability as part of sort of as part of a bigger sort of oppression system. And not just saying it's about rights, but it's also about understanding and liberation in some ways.
Yeah, and so you mentioned sort of the intersectionality that's really important to disability justice, which doesn't really seem to be as captured or as emphasized in disability rights. And then the importance of liberation, as opposed to we should just have these laws in place like the ADA, which is obviously also not
Yeah,
sufficient.
and which sort of looks at it is that, oh, well, if you address the laws, then everybody with disabilities is sort of going to be equal, even though there's bias based on disabilities. And then it also sort of doesn't have anything to address that there's racial disparities, even within disability and higher, other sort of things. So it sort of looks at it as sort of a one-off fix sort of thing rather than a multi-system dynamic.
Yes, definitely. And then another factor influencing families' experiences with the diagnostic process is the amount of information available or present about autism spectrum disorders, developmental disabilities, and early social developmental milestones. So African American families, Indigenous groups, immigrants, Latinx, Korean, and low-income families have all described limited information about social and developmental milestones in their communities. And then caregivers of color and parents with less than a high school education believe that their child's condition was a mystery. So if we look at this from an individual deficit perspective, we think, okay, well, these people are lacking knowledge. But if we look at this from a systems level perspective, why is this present? Why do some communities have less information or access into information about developmental disabilities?
I don't know if I'm going off target. My daughter was texting me, I apologize. But rural communities in my past work were very difficult just due to the access point of like coming to a local place to gather information. And then even when we used to start like Brown, Adams, Clinton, Highland, some of the communication was still done through like phone trees and things like that. And access to internet was so limited. So the information, getting it to them was very difficult.
Yeah, so there's geographical location and access to healthcare centers in general can decrease the amount of information families have. There can also be access to internet, that you describe that as a reason why some people might have less access to information than others. And then Jason, what did you want to add?
This is Jason. I think also different people learn information at different sort of rates, not rates, but different ways of learning. And sometimes depending on where people are going and the amount of people are seeing, they have less time with their doctors and being able to talk through things and sort of have equal access to care and sort of building that relationship and also going through it, just because, a lot of this stuff is on the internet and stuff. stuff, but you have to have access to that. And you sort of have to have the bandwidth or the capacity, not like the mental capacity, but just even the spoons to be able to look all up of that stuff and do self-research without consulting somebody in different.
And to know where you're looking and what you're looking for.
Yeah, exactly. There's a lot of barriers to just do it yourself
Mhm.
for a lot of people. And,
Yeah.
and not having that time in the doctor's office if you're going or somewhere that's more high volume, because some of the ways that systems are is they want the most number of people with the least amount of time to have to treat and be around people, and that can affect a lot of groups who are considered disenfranchised by systems.
Mhm. Yeah, and so kind of to your point of the amount of time spent with doctors and the way that information is conveyed. White families were, in various studies, white families were reported being asked more often by their pediatrician if they have concerns about their child's development or behavior. And they also reported being told that a screening assessment is being conducted more often than caregivers of color. And primary care providers do not often provide autism screening in languages other than English. And so this can limit these important discussions about child development, especially if you're in somewhere like you're saying that has a high volume and limited time spent with caregivers. And then James said even physical access to the internet might not solve all problems. Language barriers, so important. I remember when I was at DDVP suggesting families look into different resources. A lot of websites did not have translations into other languages. And so that is a really good point. There's also experiences that are more obviously, even though these all tie into systems level factors, there are factors that are kind of more obviously systems level factors. So things like transportation, childcare, cost of medical appointments, things that everyone mentioned at the beginning of this lecture. And this can contribute to late diagnoses for autism and other developmental disabilities for children of color, children of lower socioeconomic status, children whose caregivers have lower levels of education, those in rural and urban areas, children born outside of the United States. All of these different groups have an average later age of diagnosis, specifically for autism spectrum disorder, but this can be found in other developmental disabilities as well. And then this is also true for children living in two-parent step family households, single mother households, or households with any other structure besides two-parent or two biological parents or two adoptive parents. So basically, when we talk about all of these factors for which people have been marginalized in our society, all of those identities are associated with a later diagnosis of autism, which means later entry into services. And the earlier that children are diagnosed, the more families, literature has found, the more families feel that their needs are met better, that they feel that they know what to do next. And so this factor that many of these families are getting a delayed diagnosis is so, so important to families' diagnosis experience and then also for child outcomes. Oh, and also females with the same symptom severity as males are diagnosed later. And again, I think we have all of these research studies that are done on white males. And yes, autism is more prevalent in males, but when studies have a majority male sample and are not purposefully including females, then we learn a lot less information about how we can identify autism earlier in females. And again, I focus a lot on autism because that's the literature that I know best.
But that's kind of the history of autism too, is that it's been really hard to understand and it has a lot of biases around it and groups around it that tend to sometimes more reflect on the culture than the actual people or
Yes.
in some ways. I mean, it's interesting. Sorry.
No, definitely. I definitely agree. And then families also experience, even before, we talked about this earlier, but even before families have children with developmental concerns or bring their children to the pediatrician in the first place, they have already experienced the healthcare system. And so their previous experiences with the healthcare system are so important to their future experiences for their children. So a national study found that 1/5 of families or adults reported experiencing discrimination in the healthcare system. I think that this is an underrepresentation of what it probably actually is. Does anyone have any guesses as to why this could easily be a vast underrepresentation of the actual percentage of people who experience discrimination in the healthcare system?
Do you have to, I mean, I'm guessing maybe potentially some of it is you have to report it to the systems that you're also being in some ways understood, not affected by. And a lot of the ways that we do civil rights litigation and stuff is in also compliant based in ADA, I know is, and there's some watchdogs on some others, but it's usually underfunded and like one of those big things to where the systems are meant to be able to fight it out and have some of those things where individual people have been, and also systems sort of take away. I mean, there's been pushes to take away like class action lawsuits in some ways and stuff that gives people more power to be actually able to team up to take on some of that the systems, which makes it a little bit easier to burden some of that stuff, not having to go as a single litigant if you're going against it, as if it gets that far.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, I appreciate what you're saying is, from my understanding, is sort of depending on like what sort of situation you're in, you could have more power to be able to share your experiences of discrimination and have something actually happen depending on what is your specific situation. What I was kind of thinking about was that I don't think we notice all of the times that we're being discriminated against or being given not fair or unjust treatment, because it's so embedded in our society that it's less noticeable.
Or you notice it and you just like, this isn't worth it to actually go against any of this because is this that big a deal, or this isn't worth the hassle, or sorry, not to.
Yeah, you might be afraid to report it as well or say that you've experienced it. Can anyone guess what the most common type of discrimination that was reported it? Or a lot of times you do report it and you're ignored, or your experiences are minimized. Oh, that wasn't a big deal. Oh, you're blowing things out of proportion. So does anyone want to guess what the most common type of discrimination was? Steph said language. Let's see, one. That was not in the top 4.
I mean, I should know this since I've heard this. This is a problem, guys.
So the most, you guys are good guesses. So the most common type of discrimination was racial and ethnic discrimination, followed by discrimination based on education or income level, then weight, then sex, then age. Age is also a good. And I mean, these are all huge issues. I was just curious what people think are the most common types of reported discrimination experiences are. And then kind of like I was saying, implicit biases impact families' experiences and families' care. So, for example, when we think about primary care providers who are providing care for children, they report having a harder time assessing ASD signs and symptoms for Latinx children whose family speaks Spanish and for Black children than for white children, even when they're using the nationally recommended ASD screening tools. And then I talked about earlier the differences in screening themselves and in being asked about developmental concerns. Families also report that when they do express concerns about their child's behaviors or learning or development, their concerns can be minimized, ignored, dismissed. And this can also make families feel less confident in expressing their concerns to other providers or in the future. And then, similar to the lack of knowledge, no, we already talked about lack of knowledge. Okay. All right. So then so far, families have experienced very systematic barriers, including transportation, childcare, cost of medical appointments. Primary care providers have minimized their concerns. They have experienced discrimination as adults with the healthcare system. They might be coming into an evaluation later because of all of these factors and because they might not have had screening and all of these things. So finally, they get to the evaluation appointment to evaluate their child for autism or another developmental disability. And they have to wait a long time. A lot of families report waiting a long time before getting into that first evaluation appointment and then having to have multiple visits to ultimately receive a diagnosis. Families also experience misdiagnosis prior to finally obtaining a diagnosis that is correct or accurate for their children. And I thought it was really interesting that in a national survey of developmental behavioral pediatricians, some self-reported underdiagnosing autism, saying that families don't want the diagnosis, and that's a reason why they aren't giving a family a diagnosis. In that same survey, they said that non-white and rural families were more likely to think that autism was a bad thing than a good thing. So these two pieces of information taken together, do you think that that could lead to developmental behavioral pediatricians being less likely to give a diagnosis to a non-white or a rural family?
I think it's hard, Allie, to make the case to not make a diagnosis if it's done correctly in a standardized way. I realize that not everyone will be using like the ADOS and doing it in a multidisciplinary way, but I do think if it's done correctly, that it's hard to kind of debate that. And with some families, you will kind of downplay the label part of it, but I think I would make the argument now that because of how much we have to rely on that for insurance coverage, that kind of changes, makes it a little bit more of an even playing field, at least in my opinion. Not that it levels it out, but.
Yeah, so with more standardized procedures for diagnosing autism, you're saying families or pediatricians or anyone giving a diagnosis would be less likely to underdiagnose autism based on implicit or explicit biases or concerns that they think families don't want the diagnosis. But you're also saying that not all providers are diagnosing autism using these standardized procedures.
Yeah.
And then also related to misdiagnosis, Black children, research has found that Black children were nearly 3 times more likely to receive another diagnosis besides autism first before ultimately being diagnosed with autism, with children being often misdiagnosed with adjustment disorder and conduct disorder. And then Black children are also 2 times less likely than white children to receive an autism diagnosis on their first specialty care visit. So that's where that idea comes into play of having to have more visits to ultimately receive an autism diagnosis. And then Korean and Latinx caregivers have also described misdiagnoses, especially related to language, saying that they were more likely to first receive just language diagnoses or language disorder diagnoses before ultimately receiving an autism diagnosis. Families also describe that the autism evaluation or the developmental evaluation in general is a really unpleasant experience, especially for their, yes.
Those things, and even watching them now, I still, not that, I mean, I can imagine having to go through multiple ones and different, essentially with some of the, sorry.
Yeah, no, it is a really hard and stressful process. And so when you compile that with all of the other information that we've talked about, of all of the other things that families have experienced, it just really compounds like this negative experience. Those darn red or green blocks.
Well, I don't think we can ignore some of the history of disability and segregation and how that has been used against groups and how it's still used and how sometimes over characteristic of behavior and some of those things. And that, as much as, there probably are some authentically sort of universal autism tests, autism is still one of those things. And for autistic people, as the more and more, even just from the places for autistic people, including autistic people of color that I go through, there's so many different things that are going. It's more trying to get some of that. So there is sort of, it seems like, and I don't exactly know how those tests work, so I could be wrong, but the idea of the perception of what autism is, at least, is so fluctuating in some sense, even if there's some core components of it.
Yeah, and when you bring up a good point, because when providers are diagnosing autism, our tests like the ADOS and other screening measures are coming from, again, this like Western white definition of a disorder. And there's still not nearly enough research that is being done with people with autism and other disabilities, as opposed to research being done on autism and other developmental disabilities. Families also describe language barriers. So for English-speaking families, they describe lots of medical jargon. They describe receiving a lot of handouts rather than a full explanation of the diagnosis and next steps. For families without English language proficiency, they describe those same barriers, but then they also describe that poor access to interpreters and poor interpreter quality prevents caregivers from fully expressing their concerns. And then that interpreters do not have expertise in developmental disabilities, which really affects their experiences.
I have one other question, Allie, and I noticed this in multiple things that we're doing, and I get a little bit, you have a mixed feeling of it. It was with multiple disabilities that we talked about. We've had this idea of autism-like symptoms as part of the thing, which is a very vague definition. And then also, because one, it's just vague, and then what does that mean? And I know there's stereotypical definitions of autism, but even autistic people don't know what that means. And I wonder wonder if some of those things within different diagnoses as well, and not that the tests aren't in some ways accurate, also bleed into some of that idea of, well, it may not be autism, it may be something else that has this going with it, because we're sort of using this ubiquitous term with this sort of disability that has had a history of being enigmatic and going ups and through ebbs and flows, and now is sort of thought about in so many different things in some ways. Sorry, I don't mean to be like, and I don't know exactly 100% what I'm saying.
So you're talking about when providers say that your child or you have this diagnosis, it's not autism, but there are autism-like features.
I mean, I think we've done it with different ones. With like, I think there's a number of disabilities that we talked about in EB cases and others where they have talked about some of the symptomology of it being autism-like symptoms. And when we talked about autism as directed, we sort of this neurovention where it has some things with maybe microbial guts and sort of social and sort of energy secretion. But the idea of like, I mean, it seems like there's a variance, and it seems like I wonder if, like, I'm just that using that terminology sort of muddies the waters in some ways.
It makes it more confusing for families.
Yeah,
when
but even
this
practitioners sometimes, if
Or-
it's being used as sort of something that you can see across multiple disabilities, but it's sort of a ubiquitous sort of thing.
Mhm.
Sorry,
Yeah.
I don't mean to be mean. I'm not trying,
think-
or that I know anything, because I don't know. I'm more asking questions. Sorry.
No, I think that's a good question to ask. I mean, I think it's interesting because I mean, a lot of diagnoses have overlapping symptoms, but then when you talk about autism, which is such a big spectrum with such a variety of presentations, I think that you bring up an interesting point when we talk about autism-like symptoms. And I mean, so I'm always thinking about it from a family perspective. If you were told that your child has autism-like symptoms, I would not know as a parent or a family member what that means or how to take that or what that means about my child, their behavior, and their development. And then finally, families describe leaving the diagnosis feeling confused about the information provided and what to do next. And I think this is a huge gap because you've just gotten this life-changing diagnosis and are not sure what the next steps are to take. So this is a broad overview of families' experiences with the diagnostic process of autism and other developmental disabilities. Then I wrote a systematic review on families of color experiences with the diagnosis of autism specifically. And so the data that I'm not going to really present on next, but it's sort of the framework from which we'll work for the rest of the class on, comes from 15 articles published between 2000 and 2021. A total of 265 children were represented with 253 caregivers. And what was really cool about this study is that, not to toot my own horn, but is that all of the studies are from the caregiver's perspective. And so the point of this was not to look at what's the provider's perspective or what's the hospital's perspective. I really wanted to understand what are caregivers of color perspectives on the diagnosis process. And so they basically are reporting all of the same things that we just talked about. And then also the sample was 46% Latino or Latinx, 31% Black, African American, 23% Asian, and then 21% of the population in this sample, the caregivers were born outside of the United States. So just to give you some context for who this sample is. And so these are all of the same barriers we talked about before, but I grouped them into 4 different kinds of barriers or experiences. So there's the system level barriers that we've talked about, like transportation, cost, childcare, wait times. And this makes families This leads to families described in this specific sample that this leads to delays in diagnosis, and it leads to poor caregiver provider interactions. Families also describe something that I haven't mentioned before, that when they're not the primary or when they do not have custody over the child, this adds increasing barriers to the diagnostic process. So they might not always know the history of the child who they have custody over. And they have to go through additional hoops, signatures, and things like that to actually get the evaluation. Some provider factors, I grouped some of the factors into provider factors. Of course, the provider factors come from our system that isn't training people on culturally responsive care, our system that is valuing different groups over others, or the whole system does play into provider factors is basically what I'm trying to say. Again, these are biases. Caregivers also described a lack of knowledge of ASD among their primary care providers. Again, they felt their concerns were minimalized, and a lot of families of color were told to wait and see. So this was, okay, you're describing concerns about your child. Why don't you wait to see if your child progresses, and then we can talk about it. One of the families in the study said that this happened, they brought concerns at age 2, and this happened for multiple years, and they were ultimately diagnosed at age 7. So that's a huge, huge difference. So again, these provider factors leads to delays in diagnosis and a lack of trust for the providers themselves and in the healthcare system, and then negative opinions of providers contributing to negative interactions between caregivers and providers. And then these are some individual and family factors. Again, a lot of these are stemming from systems, but just for the sake of grouping things, I group them into individual and family factors. So these are cultural differences. A lot of caregivers of color report stigma about developmental disabilities and autism. They report a lack of access to knowledge in their community. And then families also describe a lack of support from extended family members, which can contribute to them delaying bringing up their concerns or seeking out an evaluation. And all of these factors, again, led for these families to delays in diagnosis and just made this process a lot harder. Finally, I grouped some of them into the communication factors, which we talked about earlier, like the interpreter factors, the medical jargon. All of those things impedes families' understanding of the diagnosis and just makes this process a lot harder. So I grouped those into 4 different things just so that we can talk about these case scenarios in terms of what are the communication factors for each case, what are the provider factors for each case, what are the systems level factors for each case, and what are the individual and family factors relevant in each case. So Steph, are you getting some? Okay, so we are gonna break out into small groups, and on Canvas, you should see a document that says case scenarios.
I don't see it, Allie, and I was going to say I didn't see it and I didn't see your slides, but maybe maybe let's give everybody a 5-minute break and we'll make sure it's there and then we'll come back.
That sounds good. All right, come back at 4:08.
Steph, when
Yes.
it wasn't showing at first, but if you refresh the page, it then showed the document.
Oh, that's probably why my problem, because I never get out of Canvas.
Yeah.
I never leave. Okay, let's try again. Modules,
Yeah.
DEI number 4. Yeah, I'm still only seeing course objectives and nothing under course objectives, and then only course materials is what I just put in there earlier. Are you guys seeing something else? Are you seeing something else, Allie?
That's what I see, Steph.
No, I see what you see, Steph.
Yeah, that's what I.
Yeah.
Okay,
I'm not
Allie, what do
seeing-
you, Allie, do you know where you put those?
I just sent it in the chat.
Oh.
If that would work.
And then I can put it in. Yeah, I can put it in real quick.
Okay.
Not a problem. Let me get to the Chizat. Case examples. And Allie, can you also email me your slide deck when you get a chance, and I'll post that too.
Yes.
Mm.
All right, I sent you my slides.
Awesome. Okay, so the case examples are in the chat as well as on Canvas, but when they come back, we'll have you reset up the small, and then the small groups are ready. Except it automatically assigned you, Jen, and Vicky, so that's okay. Most groups, I think, have 4. Maybe all groups have 4, hopefully. Yeah.
So will they see what group number they are?
It will show when I open the groups, it'll show in like what number it should. Yeah.
Okay, because then they can just take.
That number scenario.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wait, how many groups did you have again?
4
Okay.
cases.
That's right. So I think we have 7 groups, so we might just need to double up.
Okay.
Which is not a problem. We'll get back started at 4:10. How's that sound?
I was not expecting Uzbek to be in the top 10 languages.
Right?
This is so
Learn
fascinating.
something new every day. I love working with Andy and his team. They are so fantastic. And then I don't know if you saw some of those other emails, but he's like willing to work with us to build it in REDCap and all kinds of stuff.
Awesome. I was wondering about that.
Yeah, they're rock stars.
That's awesome. I'm so excited. Oh, do we like call through the translator services, like the number that we would call as clinicians to get a translator, and then
Yep.
we consent.
Mhm.
We need to get the consent translated too.
Yeah, and we can always talk with Andy too over the next week to make sure he agrees with our plan. I always like to run things past him.
Allie, I would love to get to meet up with you possibly sometime. We're going to be creating a survey that we want to make sure gets out to a diverse group, and we're working on this collaboration between UC Health and University of Cincinnati. So I would love to get connected with you if you'd be open to that, to kind of making sure that this survey gets out to a very wide group.
I just posted my email in the.
Thank you.
So anyone can feel free to email me anytime.
Yeah, and Christy, I'm happy to share what I've learned too in working with the Act Early project. We've worked really closely with Andy Schweitzer, who came last semester, about health literacy and language access. And he is just a wealth of information and is beyond helpful.
Yeah, I would
So,
love anything you can send or share. That would be amazing stuff. Thank you.
Yeah.
Christy, what is your role?
I just got hired like a few weeks ago through a grant. So I'm kind of doing multiple things because I'm working with Dr. Wong on a few different things under UC Health. But right now we're working on trying to potentially create a collaboration between the university and their ATS program and the university in general and UC Health. And part of the mission is trying to make sure we get access to being able to educate within earlier timeframes. And then also Dr. Wong is working on developing a clinic for IDD, a center of excellence. And so within that survey, there's a lot of needed feedback on where the gaps are, how we can better serve, things like that.
All right, everyone. So staff is going to send you guys into your groups. There will be
There's 6 rooms, but there's only 4 scenarios, it sounds like. So room 1, you'll have scenario 1, room 2, you'll have scenario 2, 3, scenario 3, room 4, scenario 4. And then room 5, let's kick it back and you'll have scenario 1 again. And room 6, you'll have scenario 2. Okay, here you go. Oh wait, what did you want them to do, Allie? Go ahead.
So it's at the top of the
Repeat that.
page, but what are the individual and family factors affecting the case? What are provider and communication factors affecting the case? And what are systems level factors affecting the case? And then in terms of like, when you're thinking about individual and family factors affecting the case and provider and communication factors affecting the case, I also want you to think on a systems level. So for example, like we talked about earlier, if the individual and family factor is that there are cultural differences, well, we can't blame this on the family. The problem is that the provider is not providing culturally responsive care because of their education and the system in which they're brought up. So I'd always encourage you guys to think on a systems level about all of these different factors, even though I group them into things other than systems level factors. So I will have you guys discuss that for about 15 minutes. And then someone will report out to the group about what you guys discussed. Did everyone get their invite?
Yeah, some people are joining, and if you didn't, then I can move you.
Am I in a group?
You can be in a group, but you don't have to be. You got put into room 3 with Courtney, Donna, Jason, and Nicoletta, but you can stay here.
Scenario. That's the best.
So I have to jump off around a little before 4:30 for an actorly echo debrief. Jen can help, or we can just put him. We're not going to do any more groups after this, right? Any more small groups? It'll just be a large group. Okay. So if they come back at like 4:30, then you'll have like what, 5 to 10 minutes. Just try to end like a little before 5 if you can.
Okay.
Yeah, Allie, I'm on here if you need anything. I've just had my camera off so people don't see my angry face.
They're trying to tell us that we have to charge the family's insurance for our ITT cases. And we're like, GTFOH, we already pay you indirects. Quit billing these people. Jen's pissed. I already dropped Jack Rubenstein and Sonny Oppenheimer would be rolling over in their graves.
I got Cherokee face going on right now.
Yeah, so you know Jen's pissed.
I'm red.
Yeah.
That's when you know, Allie.
That's when you know.
I'm either
gonna just
really mad or really drunk if I have this face. So,
I want to see the latter.
Oh, I've seen it once, and it was Jen's husband didn't talk to me for a while.
Yeah.
She was really 3 sheets to the wind, and it was not a good situation.
No, it's not pretty.
It's not pretty.
It was the worst.
Being tipsy is fun, but not drunk. Not real drunk. Nope.
Yeah. So Allie, just holler if you need anything.
I'll be right back. I'm gonna get water.
Okay.
Hey, Steph and Jen.
Yep.
Would you guys say the Kasdan method is the best book for ODD? Do you guys have any opinions or thoughts?
What was the book again?
The Kasdan method for parenting the defiant
Oh,
child.
Alan Kasdan? You mean like president of APA when I was in grad school? I had like a massive crush on him. Thought he was a badass. Yeah. Yeah, him, or he wrote my stats book or my research methods book, and that shit was hilarious. And I actually read it like word for word because he would drop in jokes and I'd be like,
Love
dude,
that.
you're hilarious. I heart you.
I really
who's the
like
other guy?
helping the non-compliant child book, Forehand,
Who?
Rex Forehand.
Oh yeah, that one's good. Who's that other guy that does ADHD and ODD?
Barkley.
Barkley, Russell Barkley. We did a lot of that when I worked with ODD kids at the residential.
Oh, this is a treatment manual.
Mhm.
Yeah. I don't know that you can go wrong with any of them.
I need to give this family one. I'm gonna like freaking lose it with this one.
That helping the non-compliant child would not be necessarily something that you would give a family, but it would be, they have really good like handouts to use in treatment.
Do you have a copy?
I do in my office. You're more than welcome.
I'm going to the office later to pick up some books if you want me to drop it by your house.
Would you?
That's delivery right there.
Yeah.
It's better than Giorno's.
Can you, it's not delivery, it's DiGiorno's. Can you just text me what book I'm looking for? And your address?
You said helping the non-compliant child.
Helping the non-compliant child. Okay.
I'll send you a picture.
Yeah, that would be a nice image would be helpful. Okay. Allie, I can't remember. Do we have 5 more minutes, 10 more minutes? What time did we say we were coming back? Like 4:30, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, you're gonna be so happy to just, I talked, so Allie, I don't know if you've talked with Sherry, but I talked with Kelly. She would be very happy to mentor and meet with you. She unfortunately does not have any grants besides her K right now.
Okay.
So that won't work. But I talked with Nicole and I got some facts and figures. And Jen and I, once we deal with this ITT issue, are going to try to see if swapping out this for that can help free up some additional funds for you on Lend.
Swapping out what for what?
Swapping out like this for that. It's all Monopoly money that we play with behind the
For
scenes.
that.
So we just kind of move pieces around the game board. And we're gonna see if we can make the numbers work.
Thank you.
So, like I said, give us the week.
You guys are the best people in the whole world.
You want to say hi?
You are. And Kelly was like, oh, I'm so glad that she's interested in this and she's so passionate. So yeah.
Look how pretty my dog
Kelly's
is.
a sweet baby angel. That is a sweet dog right there.
He's so pretty.
Hello.
What you think, Hanky? You cold? Is that why you're up here?
Hello.
Hanky.
James says he thinks we can come back.
Hanky McSpankerson.
There you are. Hi, baby. Okay,
Did you guys
I'm
get
gonna
to take a
go.
walk yet today?
Just for a minute before 1 o'clock.
Is it cold outside?
Mhm.
I don't think I've been outside in a while. Kind of forget how long it's been. It's hard.
Yeah, when I'm at Child Focus every Tuesday and Wednesday, I'm like, I'm gonna go for a walk today. Guess how many times I've gone for a walk on a Tuesday or Wednesday?
Not probably too many, right?
One.
Yeah.
Today I said it, although it wasn't super nice at lunchtime, and I had 8,000 things to do.
Allie, you have been to Jungle Gyms, right? Okay, good.
I haven't been to the one at Eastgate.
Oh yeah, it's because it's really close to Chumpucus.
I know, I see it all the time, but I'm
Mhm.
exhausted when I leave. I'm like, I need to be home.
Well, yeah, I get that.
Do we want to bring them back at 25 so we have a little bit more policy?
Yeah, I'll give, well, maybe a little after. Why won't this highlighting go away? Oh, I hate this. I hate words sometimes. Can really piss you off. Yeah, I'll give them a notice and then I'll close the breakout rooms and then I'll probably have to head out. I'll say 2 more minutes.
Okay, I'm gonna go continue my email.
Okay, have fun. Okay. I wish I just would keep a clean copy of my CV instead of always having to update it every time somebody asks for it. Wouldn't that be so lovely?
If I don't have to apply for placements this year, I don't have to update my CV.
True.
Pretty much updated. I keep it like relatively up to date. It's my trainings and clinical stuff. I'm so bad.
It's a good habit to get into. I was so good until like middle of my 2nd year of postdoc. And then I was just so busy. There was no time.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh my God, please just hire me so I don't have to actually go on job interviews because I don't have time to update my CV.
I still get really excited when I get a poster and publication. So I usually put them in right away. I'm like, yay.
That's a very good idea. Yes. Because one day you'll get to the point where you're like, when I presented something, but I cannot remember what that was.
Yeah. I'm excited for that day.
Yeah, you'll get there. You will get there. Okay, I'm gonna close the rooms. Come back, breakout rooms. Okay, and then they'll be back in 60 seconds or they'll come back sooner.
All right.
And then I'm gonna make Jen the host, because if I leave right now, it'll end the meeting. So I think I need to make Jen the host.
Mm-hmm.
There you go, Jen.
She has so much power.
Now the breakout rooms are in your power.
Roger.
I can't even see them. So hopefully it didn't kick everybody out.
Everyone had really good suggestions for the Red Cap survey.
Yeah, they did. That was great.
I've made all the changes.
Awesome.
Risha, thanks for your Red Cap suggestion. That was really helpful. That was an important piece we were missing.
Really quick, did Kate come back yet? Where's Kate? Where's Kate? Where's Kate? Not yet. Okay, well. Oh, there's Kate. Yeah, I don't know if you got my message, but I'll be back at some point. I just have to run to a meeting. If I don't see you all, I'll see you Thursday, friends.
Welcome back, everyone. All right, so 2 groups did scenario number 1. So can someone from one of the groups start by telling us what was in scenario number 1 and give us like 2 factors that were relevant for number 1, and then the second group can do another 2 factors that were relevant for scenario number 1.
I can share for my group. So our scenario was a Korean family who speaks both English and Korean in the home brings up concerns about their child who is 2 and not yet speaking. Pediatrician does not ask follow-up questions, but says it is normal for bilingual children to speak late. This continues until the child is 3.5, when the pediatrician refers the child for an evaluation. It then takes 1 year from the referral to receive a diagnosis. At age 4.5, the child was diagnosed with autism. So we did talk about a lot of unanswered questions, like how many parents and does one parent speak English or both? Are there any other kids in the home? Things like that. As far as barriers or factors, we talked about, of course, communication, because even if the parents are pretty fluent in English, there's a lot of medical jargon that can get mixed up between languages. And then we also talked about some sort of systematic level factor that was affecting the case, because we weren't sure why it took a whole year from the referral to the diagnosis. There must have been a really long time to get in, or a really long time before like an information sharing session. So we talked about that as well.
Yeah, thanks for sharing all of those. These were definitely short scenarios, so there is a lot of missing information, but you guys brought up some important points. All right, our other group number 1, can you identify any other factors relevant to this case that weren't discussed already?
So we also talked about the difference in culture. So how the Korean family view what a disability is and what that entails in their culture, and how also the physician in question might view the Korean culture itself. So on those 2 parts. And we also talked about why it took a year for the diagnosis, but then working in DBVP, it's often what we see, just because sometimes there's a long wait list in actually getting the evaluations done. Sometimes speech evaluations happen separately, just because there's a long wait list to go in. And we talked about the knowledge that might be available, or like the resources available that the professionals might have, or the families might have access to, or like the insurance as well, and that depending on the insurance, you will need a referral from the PCP directly instead of referring yourself to actually go.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up that point. That's an important point too for families who are advocating for a referral, who might, and the pediatricians are saying, oh, no, I think they're fine. They're probably just speaking late. The insurance is important too, to be able to have the option to refer, or even knowing that you could have the option to self-refer. Because I don't know that I would even think about that, like to go around my pediatrician. But in the literature review that I did, a lot of families described having to fight or advocate to get that referral. All right, can someone share what is scenario number 2? Oh, and great job. Both of you guys did great.
I can share it. So it's a Black mother brings her child into a well child visit. She describes concerns about her child's development to the pediatrician, and the pediatrician acknowledges her concerns but informs her that it is unlikely Medicaid will cover a developmental evaluation. The mother shares that she does not have Medicaid, but rather private insurance, and the pediatrician refers the family for an evaluation, but the mother is more skeptical about healthcare providers. So we kind of talked about there's a lot packed in there. Some assumptions by the provider about the family's insurance, and then just the general systemic issue that Medicaid might not cover an evaluation in the same way that private insurance might, and who has access to private insurance versus Medicaid. And so unfairly, some people who might be lower income aren't getting evaluations that the pediatrician might think they need. And then talked a little bit about the mother moving forward and her skepticism with healthcare providers, kind of based on this encounter. And we sort of related it back to what we talked about in our other session earlier today, with like this one experience is going to stand out more than maybe positive experiences before, and like what it might take to rebuild that trust, or if they continue to encounter unfair things and how that will impact them moving forward.
Yeah, those are all really good points you brought in. The provider biases, you talked about system level factors with insurance, and you talked about how this could affect this mother's opinion of the healthcare system in general and trust in providers and all of those things that really affect healthcare. There was a second group that did group scenario number 2, did you guys identify any other factors that affected the case? Who is the second group that did number 2? Okay, so Kim raised your hand. I can't see you though.
I think she's plugging her mic.
Okay.
Sorry, I was plugging in my headphones again. So we did the second scenario as well. And we kind of thought about some of the similar things as the other group did. But I think it was Julie that brought this up. The fact that she felt that the parent would then wonder what else were they missing, like in past appointments with healthcare providers. And I thought that that was a really good point. Other than that, I feel like we kind of talked about some of the same things, but yeah, just the fact that increasing distrust in providers and then also just being curious, what else am I missing for my child?
Yeah, if your provider is making one assumption about you, they're probably making other assumptions about you. Then also, if your provider is assuming that you have Medicaid, that in reality affects your care options and could affect their opinion of what sort of procedures or services or all of those sorts of things that you were eligible for your child could get. And so that assumption has so many different implications, and that assumption was taken directly from a family member's quotes in one of the articles. So yeah, thank you so much for sharing that, Kim. All right, scenario number 3. Can someone share what the scenario was and the factors affecting it? This one's a little longer.
I can talk about it for our group. So you have a Spanish-speaking mother, father, and grandmother, and their child attend a developmental evaluation. The family requests an interpreter, however, one's not available. So the father, who speaks English pretty well, translates for the family. When asking questions about the family's concerns, the grandmother describes that boys will be boys and is not concerned about the child's behavior, believing his behavior is temporary and related to bad parenting. The evaluator believes the child has autism but decides to delay giving a diagnosis. 2 years later, the child is 6 and receives an autism diagnosis at school. The parents did not expect this and had difficulty understanding the diagnosis. They ask if their parenting caused the diagnosis. So as you said, really long, so many different things that we had brought up. First and foremost, the fact that dad had to be the translator for everything. And so he's trying to mitigate between everybody. And he's not able to process any of the information himself as he's trying to pass through. Given that they're a Spanish-speaking family, depending on their culture and background, what they're coming from, how much of a role does grandmother play within this family? And does she live with the family? Does she help with the child? Is she like the respected elder? So the parents are still the ones that you need to focus on because it's their child and they're the parent, but also still just acknowledging that aspect. And I said with dad translating, is it mom's mom or dad's mom? Because he's also then trying to mitigate either between his mother or his mother-in-law, which could be harder or easier depending on the case. The boys will be boys and blaming the parents, trying to take that blame away because then that carried on with the parents of, okay, he was diagnosed with autism and it's under their belief and it was never corrected, that this is all based on them and due to their issues. And the provider kind of kicking the can down the road and saying that they believe they had autism. And so similar that was kind of brought up is you can have like long evaluations and you might not say that, hey, I think they specifically have autism today if it's not a clear-cut diagnosis and you want further testing, further evaluation, but at least bringing up, no, I think there's something more here than just boys will be boys. Here are some things you can do. And then Jason had brought up of, hey, here's things that you can do as a parent. Like this isn't based on your bad parenting style. This isn't this. Here's some resource. Here's additional things that you guys can work on. from the whole family perspective, trying to hit all of that. Instead of now 2 years later, the family's trying to deal with even more issues that were never addressed at the initial visit.
Mhm.
First and foremost, just get a translator, because that's going to help a lot of that.
Yeah,
I think
those are all really important points for this scenario. I shouldn't be surprised anymore by anything, but in looking at the literature, there are still a lot of families who talk about experiences where a family member had to be the interpreter. And I feel like working at a children's hospital, it's a really like privileged place where that's not the case, and we have interpreter services. Although families do report challenges when they're not face-to-face or when they don't see the interpreter and it's just a phone call. And we've had issues with video connectivity. So there are lots of issues with interpreter services, but just there are so many problems that come about when family members or non-trained interpreters are used as an interpreter during appointments. And so that's a really important factor in this case. And then you guys talked about, it's important for the provider to understand the extended family member's position and place in the family. And then for the provider, it's important to dispel any myths about parenting causing any of the child's behavior. And so it's possible that the provider did it, but didn't do so in a culturally responsive way that was understood by the family, or it's possible that the provider didn't address it at all. So those are all really important factors in this case. And then if they were diagnosed in school, they might be less likely to receive or get outpatient therapies, which might be important or might not in this specific situation. So really great job, Nicoletta, entangling all the factors in this case. I just got really not excited with this one, just a little overeager with that one. All right, scenario number 4.
All right, we had number 4, and I'll go ahead and read it. A Native American family who lives far away from their local hospital participates in a developmental evaluation. Because of challenges with the bus schedule, they arrive 30 minutes late to the feedback session. The provider quickly goes over the diagnosis and gives them a booklet and reviews the diagnosis and potential next steps. After not hearing from the provider again, the family does not pursue intervention services. So here we kind of talked about the family factors, access to transportation and relying on an unreliable bus schedule, their distance, potential lack of understanding the pamphlet, and potential cultural factors. For the providers factors, we talked about the lack of follow-up. It seems like the process could have been rushed and not having time to answer questions. And we didn't know if telehealth was an option that was provided to the family based off distance. And then for the system factors, we talked about there's concerns for productivity and you're constantly moving from one patient to the next patient and having that lack of time to follow up with families because of, is it billable time? And then having families fall through the cracks and not getting the services that they really need.
All really important factors to this specific case, provider and system level factors. So awesome job, Kelly, and awesome job to all the groups for identifying all of these factors. Now we're going to talk about how we can fix everything. All right. So we're going to spend our last time. Do you guys see my slides? Okay, we're going to spend the last little time talking about systems level, provider level changes that can and should be made to improve families' experiences with the diagnostic process. So I'm going to start off by just going over this one to give you guys an example, and then we're going to do the rest of them together. So the first barrier or common or concern that families of color described in the systematic review was extended family members' perception of the child or the child's behavior delayed diagnosis. And so when thinking about potential solutions, I said that providers can involve some extended family members in well-child visits when developmental concerns are discussed. And then for some families, they can and should be involved in the feedback sessions where diagnoses are shared, or can receive sort of an extra follow-up call, or some sort of follow-up to make sure that everyone who is important in the child's life is on the same page. And then, I mean, this specific barrier also gets into potentially a lack of access to information about development. And so then we could think of other things like, how do we disseminate information about autism and other social developmental milestones and other developmental disabilities in communities of color in a culturally responsive way? And so those are just some of the potential ideas and solutions related to this barrier. Does anyone have any other ideas for this specific one? So the next concern that families of color described was systems level barriers, including wait times, financial concerns, legal and custodial issues, so not having custody over the child, and transportation. So for this one, I just gave you guys one example of a potential solution, which would be increase the number of providers trained in diagnosing ASD using the ECHO model. So have you guys learned about the ECHO model? Has Jen told you guys about ECHO?
Some people did the training last semester.
That's so cool. Yeah, so helping providers in various locations better understand autism, so that for some providers, this would mean they'd be able to diagnose autism. Other providers, they would get consultation. And so this would help mitigate some of the wait times and some of the transportation concerns related to obtaining a diagnosis of autism. But what other ideas do you guys have for reducing systems level barrier? And this could be like grand, like we need to increase minimum wage, because that would have big downstream effects on these systemic barriers. But what other ideas do you guys have? It can be small, it can be big, it can be hospital level, it could be systems level.
I have one I just learned about. So I've been mostly community background, and I'm starting to intertwine into the hospitals. And one of the things that I learned, at least from the doctor that I'm working from, is all of her conferences and like trainings and things she's had to pay for on her own. And that is not where I've come from. I've come from typically when I was at the DSAGC, I got paid to go to the conference. And so that lack of having that ability to go to trainings that you're passionate about or trainings that are going to advance what you can do for families, that's really disheartening that it is all on that person. So thank goodness we have some extremely motivated and passionate people that still do that.
I had never thought of that. That is such a good one, because it really disincentivizes or says, we don't value you obtaining additional training that is going to positively impact your patient's care. And so that's a really good one and a really important one.
I think going in with some of this is also being able to think about autistic culture and autistic space, and then being able to, in some ways, have better understanding that services and stuff don't necessarily have to have some of all of these sort of diagnostic barriers to it that has a lot of these, and then sort of financial sort of like barriers, because it sort of creates a complexity, and that there's ways too that some of these things can also be done within a generalized community in some ways, while having understanding of this, because I think sometimes these things get shelved off into different things, and we don't think about cross section or intersectionality, or did somebody have multiple identities, and being able to sort of do that, just because I think there's a lot of things that it makes it sort of harder if you're in sort of in a place that doesn't fit within the diagnostic box or the systems box of being able to do things. And so, I mean, I know there's a lot of things within the autistic community, and I know there's probably a double-edged sword of that, you know, diagnostic isn't necessarily to be needed to be accepted as an autistic person.
Yeah, so you're like really going in a big picture level here of talking about like a lot of different, I feel like I heard a lot of different things
Yeah,
there.
sorry, I know I have like
No, it's good. It's just, it's good. So kind of like rethinking sometimes the concept of putting people into boxes in diagnosis. I also heard on what I don't, I'm
even funding streams in some of it that makes it so it's harder to access or have harder to do it in some ways that aren't segregated or only thought about as like this is a food security program and this is a disability program. You know, yeah.
We need to create intersections between all of these federal or local programs that provide services that are all interconnected. So again, that's big picture. That's really awesome.
Yeah, I mean, I like the idea of if there's federal funds, but I feel like local organizations do, because I think some of the things that is really important too, that it's community based and that people don't feel like it's coming from these huge systems that are seeing them not as people, or that it's based on sort of these so-called boxes of identity, right? And checking that off, and rather seeing them as community members and integrated in multiple factors and being able to be, you know, able to, whether that's going within a local church community or, you know, sorry.
Definitely. There are a lot of local opportunities for coordination. And Christy also mentioned, it's a little bit different, but care coordination. So having greater contact with families to help them understand who can help you with a referral, who can do this specific service for you. What is this service for? What are we doing in this evaluation? Why are we doing it? Like, there is just so many opportunities for better coordination and better communication with families in this process. Carolyn also said increasing the reliability and validity of ASD diagnosis virtually. Yes. There's actually more research on virtual assessments about the validity of virtual assessments. So this could help a lot of families with transportation barriers, childcare barriers, could potentially improve wait times. So lots of great things can come from telehealth. Of course, for families without good internet, although in my opinion, insurance should cover internet for all families, which is a global level change that I think needs to be made. I know there are so many more that we could talk about here, but I do want to give us some time for a couple, maybe like one or two more. We talked about this a little bit, so maybe let's do a different one. Okay, so families described that primary care providers minimized their concerns, adopted a wait and see approach, and had biases that affected getting a referral and then ultimately getting a diagnosis.
I have a question about that. And this might be part of the potential solutions too, is because I would see that like a lot of times with the disability system, we want to wait and see until it shows that it's impairing the individual functionality, and autism, being autistic. And I think most disabilities, but especially with autistic, isn't necessarily just about impairing factors. It's also about differences. It's also about, so if autism is only thought about wait and see, and I know that's the way some of the funding structures work, would that help in some ways? Because you're thinking about, oh, well, this is going to be seen as a negative. This is going to be seen as what's wrong with somebody and what we need to fix. And also seeing it as part of who the person is and what is it that that person, and sort of also setting up strategies around what they're good at and stuff. So it's not seen as, oh, this is putting people back on the boogeyman of autism or sorry.
An awesome solution is thinking about ways to decrease stigma and negative perceptions of autism and other developmental disabilities, so that it's not seen as a bad thing, that no one is afraid of autism or is hesitant about giving a diagnosis. And so I think that's such an important point. And actually, so I loved your idea about understanding a child's strengths and thinking more about like all the awesome things about the child. And then two, studies have shown when we increase knowledge about what autism is, then we can work towards decreasing stigma. And then Kim added, so first Risha said, DDBP can do in-services with doctors at PPC. Yes, that is an awesome suggestion to educate them on what to do, to look for. I mean, we're right there. That's an awesome suggestion to help increase education for primary care providers who are doing screening for autism and other developmental disabilities. And then Kim added mandated processes. So in PTOT, we're expected to complete infant motor screening and screening for developmental delay through the ages and stages. So there is recommended autism screening at 18 and 24 months. That does not happen in all cases. And so in all primary care places. And so we need to figure out how to increase that like mandated screening and to do it in a way that thinks about culture. So especially like having screening in different languages, and then making sure our screening instruments are culturally sensitive. I haven't looked into the research a ton about it, but I know that there are some issues with some of the recommended screenings in terms of its cultural validity.
I actually want to chime in there really quick, because one of the solutions, we talked about this on Actorly Echo last Friday, and one of the solutions to deal with this during COVID at least is to consider, and I still can't decide where I fall on this, consider doing away with a push for universal screening of all children, but rather focus on the children we know from the literature who are at greater risk of not being screened. So I mean, it's no different than having to ration your resources, but I also don't agree with rationing our resources in the most wealthy country in the world. So just my thoughts, but I thought it was interesting that that came up in our professional networking with Actorly Echo last week.
I get the idea behind it of making sure that people who are generally getting underdiagnosed are being able to be diagnosed, like to be able to have some of that. But I do worry about too, then it goes into this idea of, again, a diagnosis is something that is wrong, or that you are more, and it goes in sort of the thing that you are genetically more predisposed to having a child who's autistic, which then also puts stigma on certain groups of feeling like, and even people with disabilities talk about sort of the efficacy of feeling like, should I have children in a world that, is going to see that, and that it's something that's still sort of highlighting a group as having something. And I think that can have some of the trauma of it too, is that sometimes groups are more likely to be seen as deficient or defunct. And then when autism gets screened as that as well, instead of a neurological or sensory difference, then that can bring up other type re-traumatizing sort of effects of feeling in some ways doubly marginalized in that sense by, sorry, not to.
That, yeah, you bring up really great points about this sort of like deficit approach that we have. And I mean, just by the fact that we're calling autism a disorder. And then also you made me think of the fact that like when kids screen positive on an autism or other assessment, it's called failing the assessment, which is a really, like, if we think about language, that's a really messed up way to put it. Like, I have seen so many charts where it says child failed MCAT screen, and I hate that language so much. And And so again, it's looking at that more like deficit approach, and it emphasizes the importance of language and how we are not using language well. But we are going to end it there. Does anyone have any last thoughts about ways to improve equitable care?
You know, making sure that autistic people are involved in understanding, because I think there's so many things that are, you know, and that's one of the big things for autistic adults, and that's coming from, you know, I mean, mostly it's been white, but now there's a more diverse and male, but there's even a more diverse group. And a lot of autistic people have also been talking about how there's so much being part of the LGBTI community because of some of those things, and that it's not just, you know, the idea is, you know, not just seen as this person doesn't get this or doesn't do this. Sometimes it's that autistic people don't choose to accept some of the, you know, that sociality is somewhat cultural based, and that autistic people are saying, well, because of the ways that some of the things affect me, or because of what I see as important or not important, there's different not necessarily choices, but things that people identify with or don't as autistic people, and being able to understand that in sort of a cross solidarity way, instead of a lot of things have so far been saying, well, you know, and obviously everybody has different experiences and stuff, and so we want to say there's one autistic experience, but because there is some commonalities too, not undercutting that autistic can understand other autistic people's experience in a way that might be different than other non-autistic or non-neurodivergent people.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
It's sort of a cultural model as well to disability. Yes. And even know that it's not necessarily, it can be, but not always intergenerational, but it is sort of exist in sort of a place, and people would argue that it only hasn't been able to exist because when there's systems of power that make it so that people with disabilities aren't able to form communities and sort of agreements about it, then the standard becomes what is sort of enforced upon. Like other groups that have, you know, in some ways, even though there's differences because there's history and cultures that have also been, that is, yeah, so I mean, it's complex, so I don't want to make it sound like it's one way, sorry.
Yes, definitely. You bring up some really great points to end us on. And I think also the point that, you know, we need to not only learn from caregivers' perspectives when we're thinking about the diagnostic process, but we also need to think about adults with autism's perspective as well when we're thinking about the diagnostic process.
And making sure that is diverse, just like it is with caregivers and stuff, that it's not just
and
white male autism. Yeah, sorry, I just
we're getting a representative opinion from people and from who have been marginalized, to make sure that we are really understanding how we can improve equitable care. So I will let you guys go, but thank you so much for listening to me. I appreciate it, and being so awesome and participatory. I learned a lot from you guys as per usual. So I really appreciate it. All right, take care, everyone.